Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Wall, and today I will be talking about the structure, function, and pathophysiology of the uterus. I would like to start with a disclaimer before we begin, explaining the differences between sex and gender. Sex is the biological attributes that you are born with, while gender is the social roles that you identify as. So, to begin, we have to first understand what is the uterus. The uterus is an organ found in biologically born women or trans individuals with surgically implanted uteri. It is the predominant secondary sex organ in women and is part of the reproductive system. While it exists in most mammals today, we will specifically be talking about human uteri. It is a hollow organ found below the pelvis and sits between the rectum and the bladder. In medicine, the uterus is referred to as the uterus, but in everyday talk, it is referred to as the womb. As stated earlier, the uterus is considered a secondary sex organ. The reason why it is referred to as the secondary sex organ and not the primary sex organ is because the uterus does not contain any DNA or provide gametes that are used to create the fetus, such as the gametes like the testes and ovaries. Secondary sex organs function to transport, nurture the offspring, and or sustain the gametes such as the uterus. Next is the uterus structure. The uterus can be broken down into four divisions. Beginning with the fundus, as seen in the diagram at the top here, and opposite of the cervix here, the fundus has a broad, curved upper area in the location of which the fallopian tubes connect to the uterus. It is made up of a thick muscular layer made of smooth muscle and grows in size during pregnancy. The height of the fundus is actually measured during pregnancy to gain a grasp of the growth of the fetus. It is used for a rough estimation, though. Like rings on a tree, your fundal height correlates 1 centimeter to mean 1 week of pregnancy. So a fundal height of 15 centimeters means you are 15 weeks pregnant. The second portion of the uterus is the corpus, also known as the body. The corpus is just the main and middle part of the uterus below the fallopian tube opening and above the cervix. It is the main hollow portion of the uterus and expands greatly during pregnancy. It is also made of thick, smooth muscle like the fundus. The third division is the cervix. It is the lower part of the uterus and is roughly 2 to 3 centimeters long and cylindrical. However, during sexual arousal or specific times during menstruation, the cervix can move more upwards to facilitate reproduction. The last division is the cervical canal. The cervical canal is the space between the internal and external orifice of the uterus. Next, the uterus is made up of three layers. Firstly, on the outside of the uterus is the perimetrium. The perimetrium is a membrane made up of fat and connective tissue. Its main function is to help connect the uterus to other tissues in the pelvis. The second layer of the uterus is the myometrium. It is the middle layer made up of smooth muscle cells. The main purpose of the smooth muscle cells in the myometrium is to induce uterine contractions. It is here where the hormone oxytocin signals to contract and causes contractions during birth. This induces a positive feedback loop where more contractions occur until the baby is delivered. The last and innermost layer is the endometrium. It is an epithelial layer that contains a mucosal membrane. The function of the endometrium is first to thicken in order to prepare for a pregnancy and then to shed if no pregnancy is induced in order to prepare for the next cycle. This is only a monthly cycle and is called menstruation. Naturally, it only stops until the egg becomes fertilized or the woman undergoes menopause, where the woman's ovaries stop producing the hormones estrogen and progesterone. Keep the endometrium in the back of your mind because it will come up later. The way the uterus is held in place in the body is by ligaments in the pelvis, which is a part of the endopelvic fascia. This includes major ligaments such as the uterosacral ligaments, which connect the posterior cervix to the anterior face of the sacrum. The cardinal ligaments connects the side of the cervix to the ischial spines. And lastly, the pubocervical ligaments connect the side of the cervix to the pubic symphysis. Another ligament we have talked about before is the round ligament, which connects the front of the uterus to the groin and is a leftover of the umbilical cord after birth. Lastly, it is essential to note the blood supply of the uterus, and how the uterus is innervated by which spinal nerves to fully grasp the structure of the uterus. As shown here, this diagram shows two figures. On the left, we can see the arteries that provide oxygenated blood to the uterus and the veins that carry deoxygenated blood back to the heart. The two arteries that carry oxygenated blood to the uterus are called the ovarian artery here, where it supplies blood to the ovaries, and the uterine artery, where blood is supplied to the uterus, as shown here. Additionally, as shown in the slide before, the uterus is innervated by the spinal nerves T11 and T12, which stands for thoracic nerve 11 and thoracic nerve 12. This makes sense as those nerves are at the bottom of the spinal cord and have quick access to the uterus. On the right side of the slide, we are able to see an example of these ligaments talked about earlier. Here, we see the broad ligament, as shown in the red circle, covering the uterus and holding it in place so that it has great stability, which is needed during pregnancy. You can even see the round ligament in the figure on the left too, right here. The uteri has many functions. This includes, but not limited to, carrying a fetus until term, providing nutrients and oxygen to the growing fetus, carrying out menstruation, and undergoing labor. And it also plays a role in sexual response. A recent study has shown that the uterus may actually play a role in cognition too. During pregnancy, the uterus expands as the fetus grows, and once grown enough, contracts in response to oxytocin, as mentioned earlier, which ejects the child out of the vagina. Another function of the uterus is to accept an ovum that has been fertilized and traveled through the fallopian tube. Once it has been fertilized and attaches itself to the endometrium of the uterus, it gains a blood supply from the blood vessels there. Once development begins, the ovum becomes an embryo, and over time, a placenta is created in the uterus until childbirth. Some limitations of growing are that the child becomes so big that the uterus is pushed into the abdomen during pregnancy, due to the pelvis being in the way. Another function of the uterus is to redirect flow from the pelvis and ovaries to external genitalia like the vagina, labia, and clitoris during sexual response. This is caused by slight contractions during intercourse that push blood out of the uterus. So how are medical tests done on the uterus? I think a good way to learn about medical tests done is by looking at a pathophysiology of the uterus. The one I have picked is called endometriosis. Endometriosis is a condition where the endometrium is, as stated earlier, begins to grow on the outside of the uterus. The causes of endometriosis aren't exactly well understood, but there are a few hypotheses. The endometrium does as the endometrium does and begins to thicken and grow and shed in response to the period cycle. However, since it is growing on the outside of the uterus, it is trapped there, which can lead to scarring and pain or even cysts called endometriomas. As stated earlier, one of the hypotheses that causes this is called the induction hypothesis, where peritoneal cells, or the cells on the inner side of your abdomen, get turned into endometrial-like cells through hormones or immune factors. Another hypothesis is called the retrograde menstruation, where blood that contains endometrial cells flow back through the fallopian tubes, entering into the pelvic cavity instead of out of the body, and causes the cells to stick on the pelvic walls. There are many more hypotheses that I do not have enough time to get into today, but do exist as to why endometriosis might occur. The medical tests that are done to test for endometriosis are numerous, and I will mention many of them, but I will only go into more detail for two of these tests. First, there's a pelvic exam where a doctor palpates or manually feels areas in your pelvis and looks for anything abnormal. This includes cysts or scars on the uterus. Pelvic exams are normal and routinely done by gynecologists as a baseline screening for abnormalities. A second uterus exam is an ultrasound. Ultrasound utilizes high-frequency sound waves that travel around in the inside of your body and is then picked up by a sensor that creates an image of the inside of the uterus. Ultrasounds can't confirm endometriosis, but they can be used to detect cysts. The next medical test that can be done is an MRI. MRI uses a strong magnetic field and radio waves to construct extremely detailed images of the organs or tissues it is measuring. MRIs help surgeons to plan where to cut and give surgeons detailed information about the size and location of the endometriosis. The last medical test that can be done is laparoscopy. Laparoscopy is an in-depth analysis of the abdomen that is performed by creating an incision uh, the navel, and inserts a laparoscope, a viewing instrument that functions to look for signs of endometrial tissue that is located outside the uterus. A laparoscopy can give a better understanding of the size, extent, and location of the endometriosis that can be detected and even sometimes is treated during the laparoscopy itself, so that everything is done in one surgery. Treatments for endometriosis depends on the symptoms and severity. Pain relievers or hormone treatments may be used to alleviate the pain or stop the shedding in order to use surgery as their last resort. If that is not enough, then laparoscopy may be done to remove the endometriosis, or an entire hysterectomy with removal of the ovaries included may be performed where the entire uterus is removed. Here are my references, and thank you for listening to my presentation.